The torches threw long, wavering shadows across the marble floor as she moved barefoot toward the wooden shape waiting in the corner. Her steps were slow, hesitant. Her hands trembled so badly she had to clench them together to keep them from shaking apart. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood in absolute silence. Their faces glowed in the soft lamplight, their eyes fixed on her back, following every step, every pause, every breath she tried to steady. She had been told this was tradition. Every bride before her had done the same. She had been warned that resistance would bring disgrace upon her family, that it would stain her father's name and make her unmarriageable forever, but no one had told her what the tradition actually demanded, not when the contracts were signed, not during the procession, not until the cloth was drawn back and she finally saw what stood beneath it. The year was 89 CE. Rome was under the rule of Emperor Domitian, and 18-year-old Flavia Tertia was about to learn that Roman marriage had very little to do with saffron veils, scattered walnuts, or the polite public ceremonies recorded in textbooks. What happened behind closed doors, though never truly private, was something else entirely. Something even Roman historians struggled to describe plainly. Something the Christian Church would later try very deliberately to erase. Before we go any further, I'm honestly curious where you're listening from right now. It still amazes me that a ritual performed 2,000 years ago can reach people on every continent today. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. The wedding procession itself had been beautiful in the way Rome understood beauty. Flavia wore the traditional flame-cold veil that marked her unmistakably as a bride. Her hair was divided into 6 braids, bound tightly with wool ribbons, arranged exactly as custom demanded. At the temple, the sacrifice had gone smoothly. The sheep's entrails revealed favorable omens. No gods had objected. Her father had spoken the ancient legal formula, signing the contracts that transferred her from his authority to that of her husband. The words were old, older than the Republic itself, and once spoken, they could not be undone. Flavia had repeated the ritual phrase every Roman bride learned by heart. Ubi tu Gassus, ego Gaia. Where you are gas, I am Gaia. It meant she was no longer herself. Her legal identity dissolved into her husband's. That husband was Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than she was. She had met him exactly 3 times before this day. Their conversations had been polite, brief, carefully supervised. None of that mattered. Consent was not part of the equation. The ceremony marked the beginning of the legal transfer, nothing more, because the real transformation came later, as the torch-lit procession moved through the streets of Rome toward a house Flavia had never entered before. The crowd surrounding them began to sing. The verses were traditional. They were also obscene. The pheasant songs described in explicit and graphic detail what would happen to her that night. Young men shouted suggestions from the crowd, laughing as her face burned beneath the veil. Her mother had told her the songs were meant to drive away evil spirits, that laughter and embarrassment protected the couple from envy and misfortune. But Flavia noticed something then that she hadn't been able to forget all day. Her mother wasn't laughing. She had wept as she arranged Flavia's hair that morning, and her last words, whispered urgently before stepping back into the crowd, had sounded less like advice and more like a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. By the time they reached Marcus Petronius Rufus's house, the sun had fully disappeared. The doorway was decorated with wool garlands and greenery. 2 torches burned on either side, marking this as a home where a lawful marriage would be consummated. The crowd grew louder. Someone hurled walnuts toward her, their shells bouncing against her dress, catching in the folds of fabric. A fertility blessing, they called it. It felt more like mockery. Marcus stood waiting in the doorway. Behind him, Flavia could see movement inside. Too many figures, far too many, for what she had been led to believe was an intimate moment between husband and wife. He lifted her over the threshold as tradition required. Officially, it was to prevent bad luck. Brides were not supposed to stumble entering their new homes. Unofficially, it echoed something much older from a time when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed behind them, dulling the noise of the crowd outside. And in the lamplit atrium, Flavia finally understood why her mother had cried. An elderly woman in formal robes stood waiting. This was the Panuba, the matron appointed to oversee everything that would happen tonight. Nearby stood a priest whose affiliation was unclear. 3 female slaves held basins and cloths. A man rested beside a leather bag filled with medical instruments, and in the far corner of the room, draped in heavy fabric, stood a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The Panuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was firm, almost restraining, as though she expected Flavia to bolt at any moment. "Welcome to your husband's home," the Panuba said. "The sacred rites must now be completed. Here is the part of Roman marriage that almost no one talks about. It was not primarily romantic, it was a legal transaction. A transfer of property documented and witnessed with the same seriousness as the sale of land or livestock. Roman law classified marriage as conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand. A woman passed from her father's ownership into her husband's. In earlier periods, this power had been absolute. A husband theoretically held the same authority over his wife that he held over his slaves, including the right of life and death. By Flavia's time, the law had softened. Women could own property. Divorce was possible, but the core principle remained unchanged. Marriage transferred authority from one man to another, and like all important property transfers in Rome, it required verification. When Romans sold land, witnesses observed the transaction, the property was inspected, boundaries were walked, documents were sealed, divine favor was invoked. Everyone involved knew exactly what was being exchanged. Marriage followed the same logic, with one critical addition. A bride's primary value lay in her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being secured. Roman law explicitly stated that a marriage was not valid until consummated, and consummation had to be confirmed. Witnesses were required. Otherwise, how could anyone be sure it had happened? Virginity had to be verified. Otherwise, how could a husband be certain that any children she bore were his? Each legal requirement produced a corresponding ritual. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman logic. Rituals that feel horrifying precisely because that logic is so far removed from our own. The Panuba guided Flavia toward the draped structure in the corner. Her hand remained on Flavia's arm, firm, inescapable. "You must greet mutinous Tutines," the Panuba said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. With shaking hands, she reached for the cloth and pulled it away. Beneath it stood a wooden figure, carved with unmistakable anatomical precision. A phallus, larger than any amulet, larger than any garden charm. This was no symbolic token meant to ward off evil. It was sized deliberately, proportioned carefully. And as the Panuba began to explain what Flavia was required to do next, its purpose became terrifyingly clear. Mutinous Tutines was a god of fertility and sexual initiation, though even the Romans rarely spoke his name aloud. We know he existed because multiple ancient sources mention him, always briefly, always with visible discomfort. Centuries later, Christian writers would describe the ritual with outrage, but they were not inventing it. They were reacting to something very real, something deeply embedded in Roman custom. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, as Christianity was overtaking pagan. Rome described the practice bluntly. Roman brides, he said, were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of mutinous tutines as part of their wedding rites before consummation with their husbands. It was a sacred duty. It was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was hostile, but his account aligns with earlier non-Christian sources. Lactantius called the ritual so shameful that even naming it polluted the speaker. Arnobius gave the most explicit description, writing of brides made to straddle the god's emblem while their husbands looked on. Varro, the great Roman antiquarian writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned mutinous tutines as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that strongly implied physical contact without spelling it out. Modern historians often try to soften this. They suggest the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language of the ancient sources does not support that comfort. Augustine used the word insider, to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius used phrasing that implied penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the act at all because it was too obscene. That reaction makes little sense if the ritual involved nothing more than a symbolic touch.